You really want to know my call sign? The old man's voice was calm enough to be mistaken for surrender, but something about the way the words settled into the warm Carolina afternoon made the laughter linger a second too long before it faded. The live fire range at Camp Lejeune pulsed with controlled energy as sharp commands echoed across the concrete firing line. Brass targets shimmered beneath the summer sun, and dozens of young Marines moved with the confidence that came from believing they belonged to the strongest fighting force on Earth. Corporal Ethan Brooks certainly believed it. 23 years old, broad-shouldered, decorated with fresh qualifications, and carrying himself like someone whose future had already been written in bold letters, he noticed the elderly man standing alone near the observation fence and immediately decided he didn't belong there. The old man wore faded blue jeans, worn leatherwork boots, and an olive field jacket that had clearly survived more seasons than anyone currently training on the range. His silver hair stirred gently in the coastal breeze, while weathered hands rested comfortably inside his jacket pockets. He wasn't watching the targets. He wasn't watching the shooters. His pale blue eyes seemed to follow the shifting wind itself, as though invisible currents carried stories only he could hear. Brooks smirked and nudged the two Marines beside him. Looks like somebody's grandpa wandered away from the visitors' center. A few nearby Marines chuckled. One lowered his rifle and glanced over with amused curiosity. Brooks stepped away from the firing line, boots crunching across the gravel until he stopped only a few feet from the old man. "Sir," he said with exaggerated politeness that fooled absolutely no one, "this area is restricted. Family Day ended 2 hours ago." The old man slowly turned his head. His eyes met Brooks without challenge, without apology, and without the slightest trace of intimidation. They were simply steady. It unsettled Brooks in a way he couldn't immediately explain. He cleared his throat and forced another grin. "You lose somebody out here?" No answer. The silence only encouraged the audience gathering behind him. Marines loved confidence almost as much as they loved entertainment, and this looked like both. "Maybe he used to serve," another Marine called out. "Ask him his rank." Brooks laughed. "Nah, better idea." He folded his arms and leaned forward just enough to let everyone hear. "Every old legend has a call sign, right?" More laughter rolled across the firing line. Even a young lieutenant standing several yards away looked over with mild curiosity before returning to his clipboard. Brooks tilted his head with theatrical seriousness. "All right, old-timer. Let's hear it. What's your call sign?" The breeze shifted across the range, causing the distant red warning flags to flutter in opposite directions. The old man noticed. Brooks didn't. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The chatter around them gradually dissolved into expectant silence. The old man studied the young Marine with an expression that held neither irritation nor amusement, only the quiet patience of someone who had watched generations mistake confidence for wisdom. Finally, almost gently, he asked, "You really want to know?" Brooks laughed louder than before, certain he had won whatever game this had become. "Absolutely." The old man nodded once, slowly, as if accepting a burden rather than answering a question. Then he drew a single breath and spoke two simple words. "Old Bear." The words drifted into the afternoon air with almost no force at all, yet they landed harder than any shouted command. Brooks stared for a heartbeat before grinning again, convinced he had been handed the weakest answer imaginable. He looked back at the Marines gathered behind him and spread his hands. "Old Bear," he repeated loudly. "That is it. I was expecting something dangerous." Laughter swept across the firing line once more. One Marine pretended to growl. Another scratched his shoulder like a sleepy bear waking from hibernation. Even the lieutenant allowed himself the hint of a smile before returning to his paperwork. Walter Hayes did not react. His expression remained unchanged, as though every joke had already been told decades ago by men whose names had long since disappeared. From memory, he simply shifted his gaze back toward the distant range flags dancing against the bright blue sky. The breeze had strengthened slightly, bending one flag toward the east, while another only a few hundred yards away leaned west. Walter watched them with quiet interest, his eyes moving from one to the next with the calm precision of someone reading a language invisible to everyone else. Brooks noticed the old man's attention drifting away and interpreted it as surrender. "You are done already?" he asked. "Come on, Old Bear. Give us a story. Everybody with a call sign has one." Walter answered without looking at him. Not every story belongs to the people asking. The sentence was spoken so softly that Brooks almost missed it. Something about the reply irritated him more than open defiance would have. He had expected excuses, complaints, or wounded pride. Instead, he found himself standing before a man who behaved as though the opinions around him carried no weight whatsoever. That quiet confidence made the young Marine feel strangely transparent. He folded his arms tighter and took another step closer. "You know," he said, "people usually earn respect around here by proving something." Walter slowly nodded. "That is true." Brooks smiled. "Then prove it." Walter finally turned toward him again. The afternoon sunlight caught the fine lines across his weathered face, each one carved by years no uniform could explain. There was no anger in his eyes, only a patient sadness that Brooks could not understand. "Son," Walter said, "the people who spend their lives proving themselves rarely stop long enough to learn anything." Before Brooks could answer, the distant crack of controlled rifle fire echoed across the range, followed by another series of commands from instructors several lanes away. Training continued exactly as scheduled, but the small crowd surrounding the old man had grown noticeably larger. Curious Marines drifted closer under one excuse or another, pretending to check equipment while quietly listening. A lance corporal whispered, "Do you think he actually served?" Another shrugged. "Probably. Every old guy says he did." Walter ignored every word. His attention remained fixed on the shifting wind and the rolling tree line beyond the targets. Somewhere overhead, a gull circled lazily against the cloudless sky before disappearing toward the coastline. The air smelled of warm pine, sun-baked gravel, and burnt powder carried across the range. It was a familiar smell, one Walter seemed to recognize the way an old friend recognizes a familiar voice. Brooks opened his mouth to continue the joke, but before another word could leave him, someone farther down the firing line abruptly stopped walking. The clipboard slipped from his hand and struck the concrete with a sharp crack that cut cleanly through every laugh. Heads turned toward the sound almost in unison. The clipboard lay on the concrete where it had fallen, papers scattered across the edge of the firing lane as a light breeze threatened to carry them away. Standing beside it was Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer, a Marine whose 28 years in uniform had given him the habit of never dropping anything by accident. His eyes were not on the clipboard. They were fixed on Walter Hayes. More precisely, they were fixed on the old man's face with an expression that had replaced routine discipline with something far more unusual. Recognition. Mercer slowly walked forward without saying a word. Every step seemed measured, almost cautious, as though approaching a memory instead of a man. Brooks noticed the change immediately and flashed a confident grin toward the gathering Marines. "Looks like somebody knows our famous old bear." A few chuckles answered him, but they sounded weaker now. Mercer stopped several feet from Walter and studied him in complete silence. The range continued operating around them. Instructors called wind corrections. Steel targets rang in the distance. Boots crunched over gravel. Yet inside the growing circle surrounding the old man, the ordinary sounds of training seemed strangely far away. Walter finally looked up and met the Master Sergeant's eyes. Neither man spoke. Brooks shifted impatiently. "Master Sergeant, you know him?" Mercer did not answer. His gaze drifted to Walter's weathered field jacket, stopping briefly on a faded stitch line where an old unit patch had once been sewn before being carefully removed years earlier. There was only a faint outline left behind, almost invisible beneath decades of wear. Mercer inhaled slowly. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked quietly. Brooks laughed. "He gave it to us. Said it like it was supposed to mean something." Mercer turned toward Brooks, and for the first time the young Marine noticed something he had never seen in the seasoned non-commissioned officer's face before. It was not anger. It was caution. "Exactly what did he say?" Brooks shrugged. "Just 2 words. Old bear." Mercer remained completely still. The breeze lifted another loose page from the fallen clipboard and carried it several yards across the pavement before anyone bothered to chase it. Walter watched it tumble through the air with the same calm attention he had given the shifting range flags only moments earlier. Mercer lowered his voice until only those closest could hear. "Did he volunteer that name?" Brooks nodded. "I asked his call sign." Mercer closed his eyes for the briefest moment. It looked less like frustration than someone mentally opening a door they had not expected to see again. When he opened them, His attention returned to Walter. "Sir," he said carefully, "it has been a long time." Walter offered the smallest smile. "Long enough." Brooks frowned. "Hold on. You actually know him?" Mercer shook his head once. "No," the answer surprised everyone. "I know the name." The words settled over the group like a sudden change in weather. Even the Marines who had laughed moments earlier found themselves exchanging uncertain glances. Brooks folded his arms, unwilling to surrender the confidence that had carried him this far. "A call sign is just a nickname." Mercer looked directly at him. "Some are." He paused, his eyes returning to Walter before finishing the sentence. "Others become history." Without another word, the master sergeant reached into his pocket, removed his government phone, and stared at the screen for several long seconds before selecting a contact that very few Marines on the base ever had reason to call. No one expected the first call to last more than a few seconds. Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer held the phone against his ear while his eyes never left Walter Hayes. Around them, conversations faded into whispers as curious Marines sensed that whatever had begun as harmless amusement had quietly become something entirely different. The line connected. Mercer spoke in the clipped, professional tone earned through decades of service. "Operations, this is Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer at Range 4. I need a historical personnel verification." There was a brief pause before the voice on the other end answered with routine confidence. "Name?" Mercer looked at Walter. "No confirmed name yet." Another pause followed. "Then what are we verifying?" Mercer hesitated for only a moment. "A call sign." Even Brooks rolled his eyes. He leaned toward the Marine beside him and muttered, "They are actually looking up a nickname." The whisper earned a couple of nervous smiles, but nobody laughed out loud anymore. Something in Mercer's posture discouraged it. The voice on the phone sounded mildly puzzled. "Proceed." Mercer took a slow breath. "Old Bear." Silence answered him. Not static. Not a dropped connection. Simply silence. Mercer frowned slightly and glanced at the screen to confirm the call had not ended. Then the voice returned, sounding noticeably different. "Repeat that." "Old Bear." Another pause, longer this time. Papers rustled faintly in the background. A keyboard clicked several times before stopping abruptly. "Master Sergeant," the operator finally said, "remain on the line." Mercer waited. Brooks crossed his arms with growing impatience. "Seriously," he muttered. "This is getting ridiculous." Walter remained exactly where he had been since arriving at the range, hands resting comfortably inside his jacket pockets while the afternoon breeze stirred loose strands of silver hair across his forehead. He appeared almost detached from the attention gathering around him, as though the phone call belonged to someone else's life. Several yards away, instructors had quietly halted one firing lane to avoid distractions. Marines who had no reason to be involved found reasons to remain nearby. Curiosity spread, faster than orders ever could. Nearly a minute passed before the operator returned. This time the professionalism had been replaced by unmistakable caution. "Master Sergeant Mercer." "Go ahead. Do not disconnect." Mercer straightened instinctively. "Understood. We are transferring your call to Historical Records Liaison." Brooks blinked. "Historical Records?" he whispered. "For a call sign?" Mercer ignored him completely. Seconds later, another voice joined the line, older and slower, carrying the calm confidence of someone who had spent years surrounded by archives instead of drill fields. "This is Chief Warrant Officer Ellis." "Who requested verification?" "Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer, Camp Lejeune." "State the call sign again." Mercer answered without hesitation. "Old Bear." The older man's breathing became audible through the speaker before he asked one unexpected question. "Is the individual still there?" Mercer looked directly at Walter. "Yes, sir." Another silence followed, heavier than before. When Ellis finally spoke again, every word came carefully measured. "Master Sergeant, I need you to answer precisely. Is the individual wearing an old olive field jacket?" Mercer felt the hairs rise along the back of his neck. "Yes." "Blue jeans?" "Yes." "Approximately 6 feet tall despite his age?" Mercer swallowed. "Yes, sir." Brooks felt the confidence slowly draining from his expression as he watched the conversation unfold. Ellis lowered his voice almost to a whisper. "Do not let him leave. I am notifying people who will want to know he has been found." Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer slowly lowered the phone, but he did not put it back into his pocket. His grip remained firm, as though the weight of the device had suddenly increased. Every Marine watching him searched his face for answers, yet none came. Mercer simply looked at Walter Hayes with a respect that had not been there minutes earlier, and that silent change unsettled the crowd far more than any dramatic announcement could have. Corporal Ethan Brooks shifted his weight uneasily. The confidence that had carried him through the afternoon had begun to feel strangely out of place. He glanced toward the old man again, hoping to find some ordinary explanation hidden in the faded jacket, the worn boots, or the weathered hands. Instead, he found only the same calm expression, untouched by curiosity or pride. Walter seemed completely indifferent to whatever had just happened on the phone. His attention drifted back toward the training range where a gentle crosswind rolled across the open lanes. A pair of young Marines adjusted their sights after an instructor called for another string of fire. Walter watched the movement of the grass instead of the rifles. The corners of his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as another breeze swept across the terrain from a different direction. It reminded him of another hillside many decades earlier where survival had depended less on equipment than on patience. For an instant, the bright Carolina sunlight gave way inside his memory to damp morning mist hanging low above dense trees. He remembered standing perfectly still while the forest spoke in quiet signals that only experience could interpret. Leaves turning their pale undersides. Fog drifting against the natural slope instead of away from it. Birds becoming silent without obvious reason. There had been no digital displays, no weather stations, no satellite imagery. Only observation, discipline, and trust earned over countless long days. The memory lasted no more than a heartbeat before the present returned with the distant metallic ring of steel targets. Walter blinked once, and the years quietly folded back into place. Brooks noticed none of it. His attention remained fixed on Mercer. "Master Sergeant," he asked cautiously, "who exactly is coming?" Mercer answered without looking away from Walter. "I was not told." Brooks frowned. "Then why are we waiting?" Mercer finally met the younger Marine's eyes. "Because when historical records tells you not to let someone leave, you do not ask how long the wait will be." The answer settled heavily over the group. A few Marines instinctively checked their uniforms, smoothing collars and adjusting sleeves without realizing they were doing it. Even the lieutenant who had been reviewing paperwork earlier quietly closed his clipboard and walked closer, sensing that ordinary training had become secondary to something no field manual had prepared him for. Across the range, instructors resumed drills, but the atmosphere had shifted. Radios crackled more frequently than before. 2 staff vehicles rolled slowly along the access road before stopping near the operations building. No sirens, no urgency, just quiet movement that somehow felt even more significant. Walter noticed the vehicles, but showed no reaction. He had seen enough uniforms over a lifetime to know that important moments rarely announce themselves with noise. Mercer looked at him once more and spoke almost softly. "Sir, if you do not mind me asking, when was the last time anyone called you by that name?" Walter's faint smile returned, carrying equal parts gratitude and distance. "Long enough," he replied, "for most people to believe it belonged to someone who never really existed." The waiting became the loudest sound on the range. Nobody had ordered the Marines to remain where they were, yet not a single one drifted away. The afternoon sun settled lower over the long firing lanes, casting narrow shadows across the gravel, while a warm coastal wind carried the scent of pine and salt through the training grounds. Corporal Ethan Brooks found himself glancing at his watch every few seconds, surprised that only minutes had passed. It felt much longer. Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer remained beside Walter Hayes without speaking. Years in uniform had taught him that the most important answers often arrived only after silence had done its work. Walter seemed perfectly comfortable with that silence. He stood exactly as before, shoulders relaxed, watching the range with the quiet attention of a man who measured time differently from everyone else around him. Then Mercer's phone vibrated again. He answered immediately. "Master Sergeant Mercer speaking." The voice on the other end wasted no words. "Stand by for Regional Historical Command." Mercer straightened instinctively. Brooks noticed the movement and felt another small knot form in his stomach. This was no longer a casual inquiry. Someone higher was becoming involved. A new voice joined. The call, calm and authoritative. "Master Sergeant, this is Colonel Stephen Harris, Regional Historical Command." Mercer answered at once. "Yes, sir." Confirm the individual is still present. Yes, sir. He has not moved. A brief pause followed before the colonel asked another unexpected question. Has he identified himself by any other name? Mercer looked toward Walter. No, sir. Only the call sign. Another silence settled over the line. When Colonel Harris spoke again, his tone carried unmistakable respect. That is consistent with every archived account we possess. Brooks felt the words strike him harder than he expected. Archived accounts. The phrase sounded less like military paperwork and more like something preserved inside history books. Mercer lowered his voice. Sir, may I ask who he is? The colonel answered carefully. That is not information I will discuss over an unsecured phone. What I can tell you is this. If the individual is who we believe he is, there are retired officers who have spent years wondering whether he was still alive. Mercer swallowed quietly. Even after nearly 3 decades of service, he had never heard anything quite like that. What are your instructions, sir? Treat him with every courtesy you would extend to a distinguished guest. Someone from headquarters is already en route. The call ended. Mercer slowly lowered the phone once more. He looked at Walter, then toward the growing circle of Marines, many of whom had stopped pretending they were not listening. Brooks stepped closer, his earlier confidence replaced by cautious uncertainty. Master Sergeant, is this some kind of classified program? Mercer shook his head. I do not know. Then what do you know? Mercer answered without hesitation. I know that people at headquarters changed the way they spoke the moment they heard those 2 words. The statement lingered in the afternoon air. Nearby conversations disappeared completely. Even the instructors seemed to lower their voices without realizing it. Walter finally broke the silence. You are making far more of this than I ever wanted. Mercer turned toward him respectfully. With all due respect, sir, I do not think we are the ones making more of it. Before Walter could reply, the distant hum of approaching engines rolled across the base. It was not fast. It was not dramatic. Just 2 dark government vehicles moving steadily along the access road toward the range, their polished windshields flashing beneath the late afternoon sun as every pair of eyes instinctively turned to watch them arrive. The 2 government vehicles rolled to a smooth stop several yards from the firing line without lights, sirens, or unnecessary attention. Their arrival was quiet, yet every Marine on the range instinctively watched. The first door opened and a Marine colonel stepped out, followed by a civilian carrying a slim leather portfolio stamped with the seal of the Department of the Navy. Neither man hurried. Neither appeared confused about why they had come. They walked directly toward Walter Hayes as though they had already memorized exactly where they would find him. Corporal Ethan Brooks felt his heartbeat quicken for reasons he could not explain. Only an hour earlier he had been entertaining his friends with jokes. Now he found himself standing perfectly still, afraid that even speaking might somehow interrupt whatever was unfolding. Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer moved forward and rendered a crisp salute to the colonel. The officer returned it before asking only one question. Is he here? Mercer simply nodded toward Walter. The colonel turned. For several seconds he said nothing. His eyes carefully studied the elderly man standing beneath the afternoon sun, taking in the faded field jacket, the weathered boots, the relaxed posture, and finally the calm expression that had not changed since the first question had been asked hours earlier. The civilian slowly opened the leather portfolio and removed several aged documents protected inside transparent sleeves. Their edges had yellowed with time, but the names and markings remained carefully preserved. He compared one photograph after another with Walter's face before quietly looking up at the colonel. A single nod was enough. The colonel exhaled almost imperceptibly. Mr. Hayes, he said respectfully, thank you for waiting. Walter smiled faintly. Nobody actually asked me to stay. The colonel allowed himself the smallest smile in return. No, sir, but we were hoping you would. Brooks noticed something that unsettled him even more than the official vehicles or the historical files. The colonel had called the old man sir without hesitation, even though Walter wore no uniform, no rank, and no visible medal. Respect had arrived before explanation. Around them, the atmosphere continued changing in subtle ways. Marines who had been whispering moments earlier now stood in complete silence. Several instructors quietly directed live training farther down the range, so the area around Walter remained undisturbed. Radios continued crackling, but conversations became shorter and more deliberate. It felt as though the entire installation had unconsciously adjusted its rhythm around one quiet visitor. The civilian carefully slid one document back into the portfolio before speaking. There are records that describe a man using that call sign, but almost every report reaches the same conclusion. Identity unknown. Operational details restricted. Personal recognition declined. He paused before adding, very few people believe those reports referred to someone who was still alive. Walter looked toward the distant tree line where the breeze continued bending the tops of the pines. Sometimes disappearing is easier than explaining. The words lingered in the still afternoon air. Brooks lowered his eyes, replaying every joke he had made since meeting the old man. None of them sounded funny anymore. Before anyone could speak again, another phone began ringing inside the colonel's pocket. He glanced at the caller identification, immediately straightened his posture, and answered with unusual formality. Yes, General, he is here. The colonel listened without interrupting, standing perfectly still as the voice on the other end of the call continued speaking. Every Marine nearby watched his expression change by degrees. Surprise gave way to certainty, and certainty settled into unmistakable respect. After nearly a minute, he answered quietly, Yes, General. We understand. He ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and turned toward Walter Hayes. For a brief moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the steady breeze crossing the range and the distant cadence of training continuing far beyond the gathering. Then the colonel took 3 deliberate steps forward and came to a precise stop directly in front of Walter. Without hesitation, he raised his right hand in a flawless salute. The movement was crisp, practiced, and completely sincere. Every Marine present froze. Walter looked at the salute for a long second before slowly returning it with the same quiet dignity that had defined every action since he arrived. There was nothing ceremonial about the exchange. It felt personal, as though 2 different generations had silently recognized one another without needing history to explain the connection. The colonel lowered his hand first. General Richard Coleman is on his way, he said. He insisted on coming himself. Walter sighed softly. He really did not need to do that. Sir, the colonel replied. His exact words were that some meetings are too important to conduct over a telephone. Those standing nearby exchanged uncertain glances. Even Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer looked genuinely surprised. Brooks had heard General Coleman's name only in formal ceremonies and official broadcasts. The idea that a major general would personally leave headquarters because of one elderly visitor standing beside a training range seemed almost impossible to believe. Brooks looked toward Walter again. The old man showed no excitement, no pride, and no anticipation. If anything, he seemed slightly uncomfortable with the growing attention. I only came to watch the wind, Walter said quietly. Mercer smiled with respectful understanding. Sometimes history has different plans. Minutes later, another vehicle appeared on the access road. Unlike the earlier arrivals, this one was accompanied by a discreet security escort that remained well behind it, allowing the lead vehicle to move alone. No lights flashed. No announcements were made. The simple fact that it had come was enough. Marines instinctively straightened their posture. Conversations disappeared completely. The black vehicle rolled to a gentle stop only a few yards away. A driver stepped out, opened the rear door, and stood aside. Major General Richard Coleman emerged with calm purpose. His uniform was immaculate, yet he wasted no time acknowledging anyone else present. His eyes immediately found Walter Hayes. For an instant, the general simply stood there, studying the elderly man with an expression that blended relief, admiration, and gratitude. Then, without waiting for introductions or formal reports, he walked directly toward Walter. Every step was deliberate. Every Marine on the range watched in complete silence. When the general stopped in front of him, he did not speak immediately. Instead, he rendered one of the sharpest salutes anyone present had ever witnessed. Walter returned it with quiet simplicity. Only then did General Coleman lower his hand and smile. Sir, he said warmly, we searched for your name for years, but every trail ended with the same sentence. Location unknown. Walter smiled back with gentle humor. That is because I stopped trying to be found. The general nodded slowly. Today, the Marine Corps finally caught up with you. Silence settled over the range with a weight no command could have created. Major General Richard Coleman and Walter Hayes lowered their salutes at nearly the same moment, but neither man rushed to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. The breeze continued moving across the firing lanes, lifting a little dust from the gravel before carrying it harmlessly toward the tree line. Somewhere in the distance, training resumed, yet even those sounds seemed softer now, as though the entire base understood that something more important than routine had just taken place. General Coleman smiled warmly. There are officers who still teach lessons inspired by decisions attributed to your team, he said. Most of them never believed the man behind those stories was real. Walter gave a modest shake of his head. The stories were never about one man. They were about bringing people home and doing the job without asking for recognition. The general nodded with genuine appreciation. That is exactly why people still remember. Walter looked around at the young Marines gathered nearby. Their expressions had changed completely. The laughter had vanished, replaced by quiet reflection. No one was trying to impress anyone anymore. No one reached for a phone. No one interrupted the moment. Walter's attention finally settled on Corporal Ethan Brooks. The young Marine stood perfectly still, his shoulders no longer carrying the easy confidence that had defined him earlier that afternoon. He took one slow step backward, not because anyone had ordered him to move, but because respect had quietly replaced certainty. He met Walter's eyes and spoke with complete sincerity. "Sir, I owe you an apology." Walter smiled gently. "For asking a question?" Brooks lowered his head. "For believing I already knew the answer before you spoke." Walter walked the short distance between them and rested a weathered hand lightly on the younger Marine's shoulder. "That lesson is worth more than any apology." Brooks looked up. "How do you earn a name that people remember for generations?" Walter's smile deepened. "You do not try to earn the name. You spend your life earning the trust of the people beside you. The name comes later, if it comes at all." Those standing nearby listened without moving. No speech from a podium could have carried more meaning than the quiet conversation taking place beside an ordinary training range. General Coleman glanced across the gathered Marines before speaking one final time. Every generation inherits more than equipment and traditions. It also inherits examples. Today you met one. Walter looked almost embarrassed by the attention. "I only stopped by because I wanted to watch Marines train." Mercer smiled. "I think they learned something different today." A faint laugh passed through the group, gentle and respectful. Walter slipped his hands back into the pockets of his faded field jacket and turned toward the parking area. No escort was requested. No ceremony was announced. He simply began walking away with the same unhurried pace he had when he first arrived. The general and the colonel remained where they stood until he disappeared beyond the line of pine trees touched by the late afternoon sun. Only then did the Marines slowly return to their duties. Corporal Brooks watched the empty path for several more seconds before quietly adjusting his cover and stepping back toward the firing line with a different understanding of what service truly meant. He would remember that afternoon for the rest of his life, not because he had met a legend, but because he had learned that the greatest reputations rarely introduce themselves. Some names are carried by history, but the people worthy of them often carry only humility. Respect is never demanded. It is earned, remembered, and quietly passed from one generation to the next.